We turn now to First Minister's questions. We start with question number 1 from Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This morning, the Transport Minister was asked to give clarity about what the Government knew about the partial closure of the Queensferry crossing and when they knew it. He failed to do so. So can the First Minister clear this one up for the thousands of people who rely on it? First Minister.
I'm more than happy to do so, as indeed the Transport Minister did on the radio this morning. But before I come on to the issue of ministerial and public knowledge, which I will do in a moment, let me just address the central issue. I think most people listening to this would understand and accept that it is entirely normal for snagging work to be required on a large infrastructure project. And of course, the Queensferry crossing is one of the largest infrastructure projects ever carried out in Scotland. This particular piece of work will be done over 5 days starting tonight. The bridge will not be closed during those 5 days. Instead, southbound traffic will use the existing Forth Road Bridge, which actually demonstrates the increased resilience that comes from having 2 bridges in place. Yes, there will be further snagging works required over the coming months, again entirely normal on an infrastructure project. But let me make this very clear, Presiding Officer. The work that will start tonight is the only identified snagging work that will require peak time lane closures. Any future lane closures that can't be avoided will be at night, not during the day and not during peak hours. And of course, under the contract, all snagging works are carried out at no additional cost to the Scottish Government. Let me now come to the issue of ministerial and public knowledge of this matter. When the solution to this particular piece of work had been agreed, ministers were told. That happened last week, on Tuesday of last week. And as soon as there was then confirmation from the Met Office about the weather window that is required to carry out this work, that happened on Monday of this week, Parliament and the wider public were informed. In other words, there was no delay. Things happened completely timeously. But my last point, Presiding Officer, is this. Some of the opposition MSPs that I heard commenting yesterday appear to be giving the impression that this concept of snagging works being required had never before been shared with anybody. But on the 28th of June this year, David Climie, who is the project director, appeared before the relevant parliamentary committee, and he said this about what would happen after the bridge opened to traffic. And I'm quoting here from the official report. He said, "There will be a phased handover of between 3 and 6 months. It will happen gradually as the remaining snagging and other work is completed." Now, some of the MSPs who were commenting yesterday as if they had no idea about this were actually present during that committee session. So finally, Presiding Officer, all snagging works that are carried out will be done in a way to minimise inconvenience to the travelling public. That is the priority of Transport Scotland, it's the priority of those responsible for the bridge, and it's the priority of this government.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, I thank the First Minister for that long and instructively defensive answer. But lost in there was the fact that Transport Scotland knew that the road over the bridge was faulty when the bridge was opened back in August, because that's what they said in Parliament yesterday. Yet the Transport Minister said this morning that he knew nothing about the partial closure until last week. So is the First Minister happy that nobody in government apparently knew anything about a major fault in what she's just called one of the largest infrastructure projects in Scottish history?
First Minister.
This really is quite desperate stuff, but it is of importance to the travelling public, which is why I am giving long and detailed answers to correct some of the misinformation that Ruth Davidson and others seem to want to convey. In terms of the point about August, at that point, Transport Scotland and those responsible for the bridge did not know what work they required to do to fix this particular stretch of road that they realised had not been laid with incorrect tolerances. So they had to do further investigative work. They had to look in detail at what would be required to fix that particular defect. And when they had done that, they informed ministers, as they would have been expected to do. They informed ministers last week, as the Transport Minister has already made clear, and as I am making clear today. The further bit of information that they had to get clarity on was when they would get a weather window to allow them to carry out that work. So they got that information from the Met Office on Monday of this week, which enabled them to say that the work could start on Thursday, tonight at 10 o'clock when it will start, and they then advised Parliament and advised the wider public. That is entirely the correct way for this issue to have been taken forward. And finally, let me just remind Ruth Davidson of this. The bridge will not be closed. Those coming southbound over the bridge will use the existing Forth Road Bridge. So we will continue in partnership with Transport Scotland to make sure that any snag... You see, the Conservatives want to put misinformation around, but they don't actually want to listen to the answers. Not one of them. Not one of them is listening to the detailed answers that are being given right now, which I think speaks volumes. So we will continue to make sure that any snagging works entirely normal on a major infrastructure project are carried out with minimal inconvenience to the travelling public. That's our priority, it's my priority, and it's the way we will continue to work.
Ruth Davidson.
See, Presiding Officer, what jars here is the way that they pushed through the opening of this bridge in the summer and claimed it as a symbol of SNP competence. But now there's a problem. It's don't look at us, we're just the Scottish Government. In September, it was jobs done and pats in the back all round. But on Monday, we were told there'd be another 5 days of work needed. And then yesterday, those 5 days became another 10 months of possible disruption. So doesn't the First Minister see that it's the dripping out of this kind of information, rather than simply levelling with people, that is damaging the public's trust?
First Minister.
Firstly, Ruth Davidson says that somehow the Scottish Government are trying to pass the buck. I'm standing up here giving detailed answers that she and her colleagues, again, are not interested in hearing. Secondly, Ruth Davidson accuses us of pushing through the official opening of this bridge. This comes from the same party who, I think if memory serves me correctly, were complaining bitterly when we announced a 10-week delay to the opening of the bridge. The bridge opened at a time when it was right for the bridge to open because the travelling public could start to use the bridge. And in any construction, let's take this back to the personal sphere. Anybody who's ever moved into a new house knows that snagging is required on construction projects. There is snagging work to be done. The project director told Parliament in June there would be a period of 3 to 6 months of snagging work. That is being carried out. Now, the last point...
Order.
I think people watching this, Presiding Officer, I think will take a lot from the fact that people across this chamber are not interested in listening to the facts. But I will carry on with the facts. The last point I want to make in response to Ruth Davidson is this point about 10, she said 5 days has turned into 10 months. That is completely and utterly inaccurate. As I said in my opening answer, if Ruth Davidson had been listening, of course there will be further snagging works that will be required, but this is the only piece of work that will require daytime and peak time lane closures. Other work, if it requires lane closures, will be lane closures during the night-time period. So this is important. It's important to the travelling public, but it's also important, I think, Presiding Officer, for everybody to keep a sense of perspective around it.
Ruth Davidson.
I think the First Minister has to learn that if she wants to take the plaudits, she has to accept the failures too. Presiding Officer, the First Minister is right in saying that motorists have been pretty patient up until now. But over the coming months, they deserve some straight talking. So lastly, can the First Minister be clear on what happens now, because she's just said, and in her first answer, there'll be no further peak time closures. So can she actually tell motorists what other closures and partial closures over the coming 10 months they're going to be facing? How many? How long? What sort of level are we talking about? And finally, will she actually ensure that her ministers get on top of works that are needed to keep our country moving?
First Minister.
Well, if Ruth Davidson had listened to any of my previous answers, she would have got the information that she's just asked me for. If further lane closures are required, as further snagging work is identified, then they will take place not during the day, not during peak hours, but during the night-time period. And the operators of the bridge will inform the public in advance if those lane closures are required. That is the normal way of doing things in a construction project of this nature. The other point, of course, to make about the repair that will start tonight is that it is essential to allow the bridge to move to a 70-mile-per-hour speed limit, and of course that will happen before the end of December. This is a massive construction project. It was made clear at the outset that there would be snagging required. It was made clear at the outset that the speed limits would be introduced and increased on a phased basis. That is what is happening. That will continue to be taken forward properly, and any further work that requires to be done at no cost to the Scottish Government will be done in a way that minimises any inconvenience to the travelling public. That's the right way to proceed, and if in future Ruth Davidson wants to actually listen to the detailed information she's given, then she might not have to ask the same questions over and over and over again.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard. That's
Presiding officer, last week I met with representatives from the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. They told me that just to stand still, local government needs an additional £545 million in the Scottish budget in 2 weeks' time. Will they get it?
First Minister.
Well, I'm glad that Richard Leonard met with COSLA last week. The Finance Secretary met with them this week to discuss budget issues. Obviously, we will set out our budget on the 14th of December, and we'll set out our spending plans at that time. But as can be seen from previous budgets, we have, in a very, very difficult and challenging financial climate, with our budget being cut by Westminster governments at Westminster. In fact, next year, our budget being cut by more than £200 million in real terms, in terms of the revenue budget for day-to-day spending. But within that challenging financial climate, we have treated local government fairly, and we will continue to do so in this financial year, taking account of core funding, health and social care integration funding, and of course council tax reforms. There was an extra just under £400 million available in spending power for local authorities. So with the cuts imposed by Westminster, with our need, for example, to ensure significant increases in the health budget so that it can deal with rising demand, I'm not pretending that it's going to be easy for local government or for our budget generally, but we will continue to do what we always have done, and that is treat local government fairly.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding officer, it's a straightforward question which demands a straightforward answer. Scotland's councils need more than £500 million to simply maintain current services. That is teaching our children in schools, providing care services to our elderly, and keeping public libraries open. The First Minister talks about councils using council tax powers. She knows full well that increasing the council tax alone last year would not have closed the austerity gap which she imposed on Scottish local services. And she knows. And she knows.
Order.
And she knows. And she knows full well. She knows full well that we cannot trust the Tories, that the money will need to come from her government through progressive taxation. Earlier this week, it was revealed that local councils are being forced to draw upon emergency reserves just to keep day-to-day spending going on essential frontline services. So can I ask the First Minister again, will she deliver the funding that local government needs to provide the services that the people of Scotland need? Yes or no?
First Minister.
The Scottish Government will bring forward our budget on the 14th of December. And in that budget, and this is the way that governments the world over decide and present their spending plans, we will put forward the settlement for local government as we put forward our spending decisions for other parts of the public sector. But I thought Richard Leonard's question there was very illuminating, because he was, I think, probably trying to get his defences in early, but not particularly effectively. You see, Richard Leonard's core argument here is that local government doesn't have enough money. And I would be the first to agree that this is a very challenging period for local government. That's why we made reforms, or it's partly the reason we made reforms to council tax to allow councils to raise additional revenue. And all councils in this financial year opted to take advantage of that, with the exception of 8 councils across the country. Each and every one of those councils that chose not to increase council tax revenues were Labour-led councils. So right now, there could be millions of pounds more going towards local services had Labour councils taken advantage of every opportunity they had to raise more revenue. And until Richard Leonard can answer the question why they didn't, there's always going to be a pretty big flaw in him coming and presenting these questions to me.
Richard Leonard.
Well, the answer is simple. Even if every single council, the length and breadth of Scotland, had, even if they had raised by a full 3 pence the council tax, that would have raised £70 million. Your government cuts were £170 million last year. So the reality is this: the SNP government has taken Tory austerity and doubled it for local councils across Scotland. So how can the First Minister possibly promise to close the educational attainment gap between the richest and the poorest children in Scotland if she slashes the budget for education and schools? How does she possibly expect our elderly to live in dignity in retirement when she cuts into the budgets for social care? And how on earth can we stop people sleeping rough in shop doorways in freezing temperatures when housing budgets are being cut to the bone? Presiding officer, in the end, austerity is a political choice and not an economic one. So what does the First Minister choose? Tory cuts, sharpened and so deepened by her government, or re-empowered local communities, properly resourced local services? Will she stand up for the communities and for the people of Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, let me just try and work my way through what I have to say was a bit of an incoherent rant and try to answer questions that I could identify. Firstly, within a context where this government's budget is being cut by the Tories, we have put £120 million direct to head teachers in our schools to tackle the attainment gap. Which Labour voted against, incidentally. We are investing record sums of money in delivering 50,000 affordable homes across our country. We have a rate of house building in Scotland that outstrips that seen anywhere else in the UK. And in terms of homelessness, just this week we were announcing additional funds directed by an expert group to tackle the problem of rough sleeping, not in the future, but this very winter. But I come back to the central point here. Richard Leonard's argument appears to be that because he thinks councils should have got more money, then it was right for Labour councils to turn their back on the money they could have had. That is a ridiculous, incoherent argument that says that Labour prefers politicking over delivering for the people across our country. 8 Labour councils at the start of this financial year turned their backs on more than £28 million of funding that right now could be getting spent on education, social care and other council services. So Labour really doesn't have a leg to stand on this issue because its own councils didn't take the opportunity to maximise the resources that it had to spend. This government will continue to make sure that maximum possible resources go to local government and local services as we work hard to protect people against the Tory austerity that's imposed on this Parliament.
Well,